Let me tell you something many women don't realize until it's too late. The longer a man stays single, the more you need to stop asking, why is he still alone? And start asking, what has his singleness shaped him into? Because time alone doesn't always make a man wiser sometimes. It just makes him more selfish, more rigid, and more emotionally unavailable. And if you're not careful, you'll confuse silence for peace. When in reality, it's just a man who's forgotten how to love out loud. Ladies, let's talk. Have you ever met a man who's been single for so long? It makes you wonder why, not just months, not just a year or two, but years of solitude, swearing he's waiting for the right one. But when you look closer, something just doesn't sit right. Here's the truth: the longer a man stays single, the more he becomes set in his own ways. And that's not always a good thing. See, there's a difference between being alone and being prepared. A man who takes time to heal, grow, understand his worth, that's commendable. But a man who avoids connection, avoids responsibility, avoids emotional intimacy, that's something else entirely. The longer some men stay single, the more they start building a fortress around themselves. A life so tailored to their convenience, they forget how to compromise. They forget how to make space for someone else's needs, emotions, or even opinions. Because in their world, it's their way, their habits, their rules. You come into his life, and suddenly your presence is treated like a disruption instead of a blessing, not because you're doing something wrong, but because he's not used to being accountable to anyone but himself. And here's another layer: the longer a man stays single, the more he may begin to fear vulnerability. He fears opening up. He fears being known. He fears that someone might actually see through the facade of "I'm fine alone," because deep down, maybe, just maybe, he's not. Let's not romanticize long-term singleness as always being growth. Sometimes it's avoidance. Sometimes it's comfort. Sometimes it's just the refusal to evolve beyond self. Ask yourself, when a man has had years to reflect, grow, and prepare, but still pushes love away, still blames modern women, still expects you to fit into his life like a missing puzzle piece, is that maturity? Or is it control? You can't build a relationship with someone who's only built walls. You need a man who has built capacity, capacity for empathy, capacity for communication, capacity for you. So the next time you meet a man who's been single for a long time, don't just ask what he wants in a woman. Ask what he's done to deserve one. Ask what work he's done to be ready for partnership, because the longer he's been alone, the more you need to look deeper. ChatGPT said, "Ladies, let's talk. Have you ever met a man who's been single for so long? It makes you wonder why, not just for a season, not just after a bad breakup, but years, long years of bachelorhood, years of being unavailable, uninterested, or so he says, waiting for the right one." But when you start peeling back the layers, when you really begin to observe, it's not just about waiting. It's not even about timing. It's about patterns, habits, emotional detachment that's been slowly baked into his lifestyle. And that's when you realize the longer a man stays single, the more something shifts. He becomes so used to his routine, his space, his preferences, that anything outside of that feels like an intrusion. What was once independence becomes isolation. What once looked like self-sufficiency begins to look like avoidance. He tells himself he's fine, he's happy, he's focused, but that isn't always the full story. Sometimes it's just a protective narrative, a way to make sense of emotional barriers that were never truly confronted. And you see, when a man builds a life solely around himself, over time, that life becomes rigid. There's no flexibility. There's no consideration for another person's emotional rhythm. He's not used to being challenged. He's not used to being questioned, and most importantly, He's not used to sharing space, emotionally or otherwise. It's easy for him to say, "I'm just looking for the right woman," but the truth is, sometimes he's not actually looking. He's hiding behind careers, behind distractions, behind past hurt he never processed. And when someone finally comes along with genuine warmth, love, and the potential for connection, he doesn't embrace it, he resists it. Not because he doesn't want love, but because love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires practice. And if he's been single long enough, he's fallen out of practice. Now let's be honest. Some men do use their time alone to grow, to learn, to understand women better, to prepare themselves emotionally and spiritually for a healthy relationship. And that's a beautiful thing, but not every man does. Some become more selfish, more entitled, more convinced that the world revolves around their desires. And by the time they meet someone worth keeping, they expect her to adapt to them completely. They expect her to mold herself to their solitude, rather than adjusting to mutual connection. Because in their mind, love is supposed to fit in like a neat puzzle piece, not disrupt their carefully curated solitude. When he's been alone too long, he forgets what partnership actually feels like. He forgets how to listen without being defensive. He forgets how to compromise without keeping score. He forgets how to hold someone's hand through conflict, not walk away when things get tough. And worst of all, he starts to believe that love should feel easy, comfortable, and completely on his terms. Anything that challenges that, he labels as too much drama, or she's just not the one. And what happens then? Women who love deeply, who come with nurturing energy and emotional strength, are treated like emotional threats instead of gifts. He begins to confuse peace with silence, submission with love, and solitude with strength. And by the time he realizes what he's lost, it's often too late, not because women walked away too fast, but because he stayed emotionally unavailable for too long. When a man is single for too long, he doesn't always evolve. Sometimes he just gets stuck in his own echo chamber. ChatGPT said, "There's a difference between being alone and being prepared. Too many people confuse solitude with growth, but they are not the same. A man being single does not automatically mean he's using that time to become a better partner. Sometimes he's simply retreating into comfort, into habit, into control. The kind of control where everything around him is tailored to his personal needs, his timing, his meals, his silence, his space. And the longer he stays in that space alone, the more he becomes addicted to it. There's no one to challenge his thinking, no one to disagree with his routine, no one to ask the hard questions or call out the blind spots. It becomes a one-man show, and he becomes the only audience that claps. Being prepared means doing the internal work, facing the brokenness, understanding the triggers, unlearning the patterns that sabotage intimacy. But that kind of preparation takes emotional labor, work that isn't always obvious on the surface. It's not just reading books or quoting relationship experts online. It's the gritty process of accountability, the uncomfortable truths, the moments where you realize that emotional maturity doesn't come with age, it comes with intention. A man who is alone but not intentional is not preparing, he's just passing time. And here's the thing, the more time a man spends alone without emotional accountability, the harder it becomes for him to emotionally connect when someone finally does show up. He's not used to someone else's emotions occupying space next to his. He's not used to checking in, communicating openly, or resolving conflict without retreating. Everything feels like pressure, even love, even affection, even kindness. He begins to misinterpret emotional connection as emotional demand. And when you're not used to making room for someone else's heart, you start to feel like their presence is a burden, not a bond. This is why women need to be discerning. Don't just admire how long he's been single. Ask what he's done with that time. Ask what lessons he's learned. Ask how he's changed, because a man who simply existed in his singleness isn't automatically better. Time doesn't change people, intention does. If he hasn't been intentional, he's likely been drifting, emotionally checked out, physically present but unavailable for anything real. You'll notice it in how he talks about women, about relationships. About love, there's a coldness, a detachment, not because he's heartless, but because he's emotionally out of practice. Love requires openness, partnership requires presence. But if he's spent years only practicing independence, it's going to take time, real time, for him to remember how to hold someone else's heart with care. He may want love, but he's lost the language of it. He may desire connection, but he's forgotten how to maintain it. Being single isn't the issue. It's what you do with that singleness that matters. Some men become better, more aware, more emotionally intelligent, more grounded. Others become hardened, rigid, distant, convinced that their way is the only way, and that's when relationships suffer. Because the longer a man has existed without practicing empathy, communication, and compromise, the more likely he is to resist those very things when love comes knocking. He doesn't know how to merge lives. He only knows how to protect his own. So when a woman enters his world, he doesn't adapt. He expects her to shrink herself, to tiptoe around his schedule, to accept crumbs of connection. Not because he's a bad person, but because he's unpracticed in emotional partnership. You can't build a future with someone who's only rehearsed solitude. A man who has been alone too long without growth becomes emotionally inflexible. He may want companionship, but he struggles with coexistence. He wants love on his terms, when he's ready, when it fits, when it doesn't disturb his routine. And that's not love. That's convenience wearing a mask. He becomes so used to his routine, his space, and his preferences that he no longer sees how tightly he's clinging to control. Every detail of his day, what he eats when he sleeps, how he unwinds, becomes sacred. Not in a healthy, self-care kind of way, but in a possessive way. There's no room for disruption, no tolerance for unpredictability, and certainly no patience for another human being who doesn't fit seamlessly into the structure he's built. The longer he remains single, the more the idea of compromise feels like an attack rather than an act of connection. And when someone enters his life with softness, love, and the natural complexities of emotion, he pulls back, not because she's doing something wrong, but because the very nature of partnership threatens the comfort he's cultivated. He starts to associate love with loss of control. He believes that letting someone in means losing something instead of gaining a deeper version of life. It becomes hard for him to distinguish between independence and isolation. He prides himself on doing everything alone, and with each passing year, that pride becomes a wall so tall that not even the most patient woman can climb it without bleeding in the process. And if she dares to ask for more presence, more transparency, more effort, he calls it pressure. He brands it as neediness, but in truth he's just unfamiliar with emotional responsibility. He's not used to carrying someone else's feelings alongside his own. In his solitude, he's mastered the art of detachment. He's learned how to feel just enough to keep a conversation going, but not enough to create real intimacy. He says all the right things, but his actions never cross into the territory of real commitment. He may take you out, text you regularly, even call you his girlfriend, but when it's time to emotionally show up, he vanishes into silence. Because love that asks something of him, patience, presence, effort, feels too heavy. Not because he's heartless, but because he hasn't exercised those emotional muscles in a long time, maybe never. And then there's the deeper fear, the fear of being seen. When a man has been single for too long, he becomes an expert at hiding in plain sight. He learns how to keep things surface level. He'll charm you, entertain you, make you laugh, and even talk about his past. But ask him about his deepest wounds, his regrets, his fears, and you'll notice the energy shift. You'll hear the pauses, you'll feel the wall go up, because vulnerability isn't just unfamiliar to him, it's uncomfortable. It threatens the image he's carefully curated, an image of strength, independence, and control. Letting you in means exposing parts of himself he hasn't even acknowledged in private. He's not just protecting himself from you, he's protecting himself from himself. From his own feelings, from his own insecurities, from the possibility that he may not be as healed, as ready, or as whole as he tells himself. And this is the trap many women fall into. We assume time equals growth. We assume that a man who's been single for years must have evolved, must have matured, must have clarity about love. But what if all he's done is retreat? What if his singleness isn't a sign of preparation, but a symptom of emotional paralysis? The longer he's been alone, the more he starts to believe that his world is complete as is. He stops seeing love as a partnership and starts viewing it as a performance, something that must be controlled, timed, and edited to fit the version of life he approves of. And when love finally arrives, when it challenges him to open up, to make space, to give something of himself beyond the surface, he doesn't know how to respond. Not because the love isn't real, but because real love doesn't operate on his schedule or bend to his preferences. You come into his life, and suddenly your presence feels like a disruption. Not because you're loud or overbearing, but because he's not used to sharing space, physical or emotional. He's built his life in a way where everything caters to him. His routines are fixed, his environment is curated, his expectations are centered around convenience. The longer he's lived in this solo rhythm, the more foreign partnership becomes. He starts to see relationships not as a shared journey, but as something that demands too much from him. Too much time, too much effort, too much emotional energy. And it's not that he doesn't want love, it's that he doesn't want the discomfort that comes with growing alongside someone else. Over time, he begins to convince himself that love should be easy, that if it's meant to be, it won't challenge him, it won't require sacrifice or stretch him out of his comfort zone. But that's not real love, that's fantasy. Real love requires two people choosing each other over and over again, especially when it's inconvenient. Real love means vulnerability, patience, and growth. And if he's been alone too long, he forgets what that feels like. He forgets how to hold space for another person's emotions without taking it personally. He forgets how to navigate conflict without shutting down or walking away. He forgets how to be present, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. When he's been single for years, every minor adjustment starts to feel like a major compromise. You ask for a little more communication, and he sees it as pressure. You express your feelings, and he sees it as drama. You try to understand him, and he sees it as interrogation, not because you're doing anything wrong, but because he hasn't had to answer to anyone in a very long time. He's forgotten what emotional accountability looks like. He's out of practice when it comes to empathy and consideration. And instead of recognizing the value of a woman who's emotionally available, he pulls back, unsure of how to reciprocate. The danger is that the longer a man is single, the more he starts to believe that the problem lies outside of himself. He'll blame timing, he'll blame modern dating, he'll blame women for being too this or not enough that. But rarely does he stop to ask himself the hard questions. Rarely does he reflect on how his habits have hardened, how his mindset has narrowed, or how his emotional muscles have weakened. Because accountability requires humility, and humility is hard to practice in solitude. What often happens is that women walk into his life hoping to build something meaningful, but they end up feeling like intruders. They are expected to adapt to his life, not co-create a new one. They're given the illusion of inclusion while constantly being kept at arm's length, and eventually the woman begins to feel exhausted, not because she's asking for too much, but because he's offering too little. His version of love is convenience. His version of commitment is conditional. And when things don't go his way, he retreats back into solitude, convinced that being alone is better than being vulnerable. This kind of man is not heartless. He's just unpracticed, unfamiliar with the emotional give and take required in partnership. And if he's not intentional about unlearning those habits, he risks pushing away every woman who tries to love him. Because love cannot survive in a space where only one person is willing to grow. It cannot flourish where compromise is seen as weakness and vulnerability is treated as a threat. The longer a man is single, the more likely he is to protect his comfort instead of investing in connection. So if you're a woman standing in front of a man who's been single for years, don't just fall for the surface. Pay attention to the patterns. Listen to how he speaks about partnership. Watch how he handles your heart. Because love isn't about fitting into someone's perfect routine. It's about building something imperfect together. And if he's not willing to stretch, to unlearn, to meet you in the middle, then maybe he's not ready for the kind of love you deserve. Never shrink to fit into a space that was never built to hold real connection. You're not asking for too much. You're just asking the wrong person.